close your eyes for a moment. Picture 5 figures standing in a half circle at the edge of something enormous, not the edge of a physical place, though one of them is enormous enough to dwarf the stone corridor behind them, and not the edge of a metaphor, though the thing they are standing at the edge of will prove, in time, to be the edge of everything they understood. 5 figures in the torchlit antechamber of a kingdom that still believes in itself, each one carrying a different shape of the same fundamental quality: the willingness to stand between what they love and whatever comes for it. They were called the 5 Great Knights of Hallownest. Their names are Hegemol, Drya, Isma, Zima, and Ogrim. And each of those names, by the time the knight walks through the ruins of what they protected, is a ghost of a different kind, a different shape of loss, a different quality of echo, a different answer to the question that all great stories about warriors eventually arrive at. What happens to the sword when the war is over? Some of them fought. Some of them were transformed. One of them retreated into something so deep that soldiers found his armour and wore it, and never wondered whose it was. One of them sits still in the ruins, waiting with the unshakable patience of someone who cannot imagine a world in which the wait is not eventually rewarded. And one of them stands in a shadowed corner of the royal waterways with a delicate pale flower in her hand, asking a small and silent stranger to carry it somewhere she cannot go. Get comfortable. Let the weight of blanket and pillow do the work that your body has been holding for too long. Let your breath find its own pace. I'm going to tell you everything about the 5 Great Knights of Hallownest. Before we begin, I want to take a moment and speak with you directly. If you are here, if you found this video and you're listening to it now, letting this story carry you towards sleep, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. The ones who love these worlds too much to let them go when the credits roll. The ones who feel the architecture of a well-built game the way other people feel humidity, in the texture of every breath, in the weight that settles over them when they sit still long enough to notice it. Some of you know Hollow Knight the way you know a book you've memorized without meaning to, where you can place every room and every piece of dialogue and every hidden wall just from the memory of having looked at it long enough. Some of you are arriving here for the first time. Some of you have been here before, listening to other videos in this series, and you know the particular quality of quiet that settles over the Pale King's story or the Dreamer's story, and you're here to find that same quality again in the story of the people who stood at the king's side. Wherever you are arriving from, welcome. If you find that this kind of video helps you, if the combination of a world you love and a voice that moves slowly and carefully through it is useful to your nights, then I would love for you to subscribe. Not because the number matters in itself, but because subscribing tells the algorithm that this kind of content is worth finding. There are people out there right now who need exactly this, who would spend an hour listening to someone carefully, lovingly, unhurriedly tell the lore of Hallownest's greatest warriors, and they don't yet know this video exists. Subscribing helps them find it. And if something in the telling resonates with you, if a particular moment lands, if a detail you had forgotten comes back with the specific weight of something you cared about more than you knew, leave a comment, one word, a name, the name of the knight whose story hit hardest. Those comments are read, every one of them. They matter more than any algorithm can measure. The story will be here whether you do any of this. But if you stay, if you come back, I hope you will. Now, let me tell you about the 5 Great Knights. They did not begin as a category. They were not conceived as a unit, as a council, as a tribunal of the most capable beings the kingdom had produced. Each of them had a life and an identity and a set of qualities that would have distinguished them in any company before they were ever assembled into the shape that history remembers them by. The category, the 5 great knights, singular noun, named and numbered and understood as a thing, was the product of a king who recognized what he had found when he found them, and who chose to recognize it formally, which is how kings make things real. The Pale King understood the value of what each of them was. He was a being of extraordinary perception, a world force compressed into a smaller shape, with the accumulated understanding of something that had existed since before the concept of civilization, that had chosen to reduce itself into the form of a creature that could walk among its subjects and be recognized as the one responsible for what was happening around them. He understood people. He understood the specific qualities that made certain individuals into something more than the sum of their physical capabilities, the beliefs, the devotions, the relationships to specific ideas and places and other people, that produce someone for whom the word knight is not simply a rank, but a description of a total orientation toward the world. He found 5 of them, and what each of them was, what the specific quality was that made each of them irreplaceable, that made the Pale King look at them and understand that they were something different from everyone else he had, is the story we are going to tell tonight. Not the story of their battles, which were many, and which the ruins of Hallownest preserve evidence of, in the scorch marks on walls and the shattered stone of places that were tested and held and sometimes yielded. But the story of their characters, the story of who they were in the specific irreducible way that characters are who they are, not by what they do but by why they do it, and what it cost them, and what they love enough to make those costs bearable. Let us begin with Hegemol, because he is in some ways the most literal of them, and because beginning with the most literal makes the more complicated ones easier to hold when they arrive. Hegemol was enormous. This is not the beginning of his description. It is his most visible quality, and visible qualities are easy to misread as essences. Many very large things are not particularly significant. Hegemol was large and significant, but the significance was not a consequence of the largeness in a simple way. It was more that the largeness was a physical expression of something internal, that the scale of his body reflected the scale of his commitment to a specific function, the way that some people seem to grow into the exact shape of what they have decided to spend their lives doing. His shell, the layered articulated exoskeletal armour that he wore, or that was simply him in the way that shells are simply the beetles who grow them, was a thing of considerable engineering and considerable natural design. The plates overlapped in the way of something evolved to absorb impact rather than deflect it. Where lighter armour deflects, turns a blow away, redirects force into a direction where it can do less harm. Hegemol's shell absorbed. It took the energy of a strike and distributed it across the surface of something dense enough to accept that distribution without failing. He was not agile in the way of Dryer, who we will come to. He was not subtle in the way of Isma. He was not devastatingly lethal in a single strike the way that each of them could be in their specific mode. He was a wall, an articulated, choosing, intentional wall, but a wall nonetheless. Kind of defensive presence that changes the geography of a battle simply by being in it. He was the most physically imposing of the 5. In any room he stood in, the primary spatial fact of the room was Hegemol. Other things occupied the room. Hegemol defined it. But this is the thing that is easy to miss about Hegemol and essential to understand. The enormity was not what distinguished him. The shell was not his most important quality. His most important quality was something quieter and more inward than the shell suggested, a patience, a steadiness, a capacity to be in a situation requiring endurance for as long as the situation required endurance, without the specific psychological cost that prolonged endurance exacts from almost everyone else. Hegemol could wait. Not in the way of someone suppressing impatience. Impatience requires a background desire for things to be other than they are, and from what the lore preserves of Hegemol's character, he did not seem to experience time in that impatient mode. He was genuinely comfortable with the long duration of things. He could hold a position not just physically, but temperamentally, in the place, in the moment, for as long as the moment required. This is rarer than it sounds. The capacity to endure without the corrosive anger at endurance that most endurance involves is a specific and unusual quality, and it was Hegemol's most fundamental characteristic. More fundamental than the shell, more fundamental than the enormous physical presence that made him so easy to locate in any battle. The shell gave the endurance a practical expression. The temperament made the endurance real. The Pale King knew what he had in Hegemol. A figure like him is rare in any king's court. Someone whose presence on a contested border or a threatened passage is not merely physical, but atmospheric. The knowledge that Hegemol was somewhere changed the texture of what was happening there. Enemies adjusted, allies steadied. The physical fact of someone that committed to the function of protection, in a form built specifically to fulfill it, is not simply a tactical resource. It is a statement, a declaration, in a language that does not require words, that this is a place that will not yield easily, that whoever wants what is being defended here will have to earn it in full. He was Hallownest's most irrefutable declaration that the kingdom intended to be here. The lore preserves what happened to Hegemol, and it preserves it in the way that Hollow Knight preserves its most sorrowful things, quietly, through evidence rather than testimony, through the specific fact that his shell is present in the game but he is not. By the time the knight descends into the ancient basin, the region below the City of Tears, below the waterways, the deep place where the White Palace once presided over everything below it, Hegemol's armour has been found, and it has been taken. The beings that the game calls the Watcher Knights, heavy, powerful armoured figures that guard the path to the White Palace's sealed entrance, are wearing it. They are not Hegemol. They have no idea that they are wearing the shell of one of Hallownest's 5 great knights. The armour did not come to them with its history attached. It came to them the way abandoned things come to the creatures that find them in ruins, as a useful object, a resource, something that serves the function it was designed for regardless of what happened to the being it was designed for. This is Hegemol's tragedy, and it is one of the game's quietest, devastating images. Not dramatic defeat, not a boss fight, not a last stand preserved in a memory that the Dream Nail can access. Just an empty shell, being worn by something that has no name for it. The knight who built a life around the function of protection has been replaced, passively, by the armour that expressed that function. The armour endures. Hegemol does not. What happened to him? The lore offers only the architecture of implication. When the infection began spreading through Hallownest, when the orange corruption started pooling in the eyes of citizens, and the kingdom's institutions began failing under the weight of a crisis that neither swords nor scholars could adequately address, several of Hallownest's most powerful beings chose a kind of retreat. Not flight. Retreat, in the military sense of a controlled withdrawal to a position that provides better odds, even if those odds are simply the odds of not being immediately consumed by what was consuming everything else. Dormancy, sleep. Hegemol retreated into the depth somewhere and slept. His shell was not on him when he did. Whether the shell was taken while he slept, whether he had removed it before retreating, whether some sequence of events we cannot reconstruct from the available evidence separated the armour from the night before the dormancy. The game does not say. What it gives us is the armour, in the hands of something else, in the place below the city. And the implication that somewhere, deeper still, the being who wore it sleeps on, unaware that what he spent his life building, the imposing, inarguable physical fact of his protective presence, has been inherited by things that didn't earn it and don't know what it means. There is something in this that is not simply sad but philosophically precise. Hegemol's qualities were the most transferable of the 5 great knights. The shell could be worn by anything large enough. The intimidating physical presence could be projected by any being encased in that armour, regardless of the character underneath it. What made Hegemol irreplaceable? The patience, the endurance, the specific temperament that could inhabit that armour and sustain it through the duration of whatever was coming, is not findable in the Watcher Knights. They are wearing his shell. They have none of his self. The form endures without the person who gave it meaning, and this is as precise an image of loss as Hollow Knight ever produces. Sleep, Hegemol, wherever you are in the deep stone, whatever small chamber you found when the world was no longer safe for the function you had built yourself to serve. Sleep, and let the armour be armour. The knight you were is still there, somewhere under all of that rock. Dryia is the second of the 5, and she is the one the lore treats with the most direct clarity, because her ending, unlike Hegemol's slow disappearance into dormancy, is specific and located and preserved in the physical fact of where the knights finds her. She died in the Queen's Gardens. Before that, she lived in service. This is the central fact of Drya's character, and it is the kind of fact that requires unpacking because service in its most superficial form is simply obedience, and what Drya expressed was categorically different from obedience. Obedience is a relationship to authority. What Drya had was a relationship to the person at the centre of the kingdom's governing purpose, to the Pale King himself, and to whatever she understood from close observation and genuine engagement with who he was, that he represented. She was his personal protector, not in the ceremonial sense of a guard who stands at a door and announces visitors. In the functional sense, the being most directly responsible for ensuring that whatever came for the Pale King, whether that was a threat, an assassin, a political incursion, or the more abstract pressures of a kingdom under siege, found her before it found him. She positioned herself between the throne and the world with the specificity of someone who had thought carefully about what that positioning required, and had made the decision that it was where she belonged. Her fighting style, as preserved in the game's design logic, was precise. Where Hegemol absorbed, Drya cut. She was not heavy armour and endurance, but controlled lethality. The kind of fighter whose effectiveness comes not from the raw power of any individual strike, but from the precision with which each strike is placed. The economy of motion, the understanding of exactly how much force is needed and exactly where to apply it, so that excess is never expended. She was fast where Hegemol was immovable. She was exact where he was implacable. She was, in the vocabulary of warriors, a blade in the fullest sense, something that, when correctly applied, achieves its purpose with the minimum necessary means. But the precision was not what defined her. The precision was the expression of something else, the totality of her commitment to the specific thing she had decided to protect. When someone commits to a protective function at that level of fullness, When every morning begins and every night ends with the question of whether the thing you have placed yourself in front of is still safe, the practical skills of protection become almost incidental. They are the instrument, the commitment is the music. Dryia had decided at some point in her history that the lore does not detail for us, that the Pale King's project, the civilization of Hallownest, the mind gift, the luminous and fragile experiment of conscious beings building something worth protecting, was worth dedicating her entire capacity to defending. That decision did not waver, not when the infection began to spread, not when citizens started to be hollowed, not when the Pale King retreated, first to the political distance of a king managing a crisis from behind layers of institutional response, and then to the literal distance of the White Palace, and then to the dream realm, further and further from the physical world that Dryia was defending. She held her assignment even as the thing she was assigned to protect became harder to locate, harder to articulate, harder to understand as a coherent entity worth defending. She died defending the Queen's Gardens. The Queen's Gardens are the White Lady's domain, a region of the underground where flowers bloom in colours too warm for the stone they grow from, where silk webs hang between pale branches in a way that suggests intentionality rather than the haphazard spinning of creatures operating on instinct. The garden was the White Lady's project and the White Lady's residence, and it stood, by the time the infection reached its height, as one of the last genuinely beautiful places in a kingdom becoming a ruin. In a world of orange corruption and hollowed citizens and the sound of the infection spreading through the walls, the Queen's Gardens were anomalous, still tended, still growing, still expressive of a deliberate aesthetic vision that refused to be consumed by the surrounding catastrophe. Someone had to defend them, not simply because the gardens were beautiful, though they were, not simply because the White Lady lived there, though she did, and her survival was a matter of enormous consequence to whatever plan the Pale King had developed, but because the gardens represented something that the crisis required to survive. The proof that what Hallownest had been, the specific aesthetic aspiration, the idea that beauty was worth providing in the underground alongside all the more practical things that civilization provides, was not entirely lost. The gardens were evidence that the kingdom had not been wholly hollowed, that something of what it had been was still there, still growing, still ordered by the same intention that had ordered it when Hallownest was at its height. Dryia held that evidence. She stood at the garden's approaches and she held them. The Traitor Lord came for them. The Traitor Lord is the leader of the Mantis faction that chose to side with the Radiants, an alignment that the game presents without extended moralizing, but with all the information necessary to understand what it meant. The Mantis tribe had always held themselves apart from Hallownest's kingdom, proud, self-governing, militarily formidable in ways that the Pale King's administration had found easier to acknowledge than to challenge. They inhabited the fungal wastes in a state of careful non-alliance with the civilization above them. They were not enemies, they were not subjects. They were something the kingdom had made space for rather than space for them, and that arrangement had held through the years of Hallownest's stability, because stability is excellent at maintaining the arrangements built into it. The infection destabilized everything, and in the destabilization some Mantis chose a side. The Traitor Lord led those who chose the Radiance, not from belief, perhaps not from genuine devotion to the ancient light goddess of the underground, but from the increasingly common logic of crisis allegiance. Whoever looks like they are winning is the one worth following, and the radiance spreading through the kingdom's citizens and hollowing mind after mind after mind looked like she was winning. The traitor lord led that faction to the Queen's gardens. Whether to take them, to destroy them, to break the symbolic evidence of what Hallownest had been and could be, the game does not specify the precise motivation. What it gives us is the aftermath. A Hollow Knight boss fight against the traitor lord in the gardens, and Dryar dead. Where did Dryar fall? The gardens do not specify a grave. The game does not make her death visible to you directly, does not show you the moment of it. What it shows you is its consequence. A traitor lord who reached the gardens, which means someone who was defending the gardens no longer could. The gap in the defence is the proof of the fall. Dryar's death is legible from the fact that the thing she was defending was successfully attacked. She died in the Queen's gardens in the last expression of the function she had organised her life around. This is the specific shape of honour that her kind of commitment produces. Not honour as an abstraction, not honour as a thing you point to from outside a life and identify as having been present, but honour as the direct experience of a life meeting its hardest moment in the exact form the life was built to meet. She was there when the thing she protected needed protecting. She was there and she fought and she did not yield easily. And then she was not there, and the gardens were less safe, and the White Lady sealed herself more deeply in her pod, and the kingdom moved further toward the ruin that the knight would eventually walk through. There is something in Dryar's story that applies the specific comfort of the complete. Not comfortable in the sense of painless. Her death was not painless, and the loss of her was not small, and the garden's vulnerability after her fall was not insignificant, but complete in the sense of fully expressed. She expressed her life's commitment to its fullest possible extent. Nothing was held back. Nothing was preserved at the cost of the function. She was the sword she had chosen to be, all the way to the end. This is all we can ask of the specific orientation toward life that warriors represent, the full expression of what they are, in the moment that most requires it. Sleep, Dryar. The gardens are quieter now. The flowers still grow. The silk still hangs between the branches. They are still there, still beautiful, still in the shape you died to preserve them in. Whatever you protected long enough. Then there is Isma, and Isma's story is the one that requires the most patience to understand, because what happened to her does not resemble the kinds of endings that the words death and defeat and retreat are built to describe. Isma was changed. Let me begin where Isma's story begins, which is not with transformation but with assignment. She was the guardian of a place called Isma's Grove, a warm enclosed corner of the royal waterways, the vast pipe and reservoir network that lies beneath the City of Tears and carries the water that falls perpetually through that city's streets. The waterways are generally hostile in the way that pipe systems become hostile, when they have been abandoned and their previous inhabitants have been replaced by whatever fills abandoned spaces, dangerous creatures accumulating acid, the particular dark that gathers in enclosed systems when the maintenance stops. Moving through the waterways requires constant attention and significant resistance to things that would rather you weren't there. Isma's Grove is different. The grove is warm in a way the waterways generally are not, a warmth that comes from something living rather than from any external heat source, from the particular biological temperature of a concentrated mass of growing things. There's a great tree at the grove's centre. It fills the available space with the specific quality of presence that very old trees have, not threatening, not inert, but present in the way of something that has been in the same place for long enough that the place has organised itself around it. The roots of the tree spread beyond the visible edges of the grove, through the walls and floors, into the waterways beyond, connecting the grove to everything around it through the slow, patient language of underground growth. And the acid in the royal waterways does not burn you in the grove. This is the crucial physical fact. The acid that covers the floors of the waterways, a dangerous, damaging substance that makes the route through them punishing under ordinary circumstances, is absent in the grove's warmth. You cannot be harmed by it here. Why? Because of what Isma became. This is the transformation, not a metaphor, a literal, physical, complete biological transformation that Isma underwent at some point during the crisis, not because she chose it in the simple sense of choosing to change form, but because she gave herself to the grove in a way that made change the inevitable consequence. She became the tree. Or more precisely, she became what she had always been in spirit. The protective essence of this particular place, expressed in a physical form that could not be removed from it, that was not distinct from it. That was the grove's own biological identity made manifest in something that had once been a night. Her protection became ambient. That is the most precise way to say it. Where Drya's protection was expressed through combat, through the direct physical interposition of a capable warrior between threat and protected thing, Isma's protection became the atmosphere of the grove itself, the warmth, the quality of the air, the particular resistance of the surrounding environment to the acids of the waterways. She is in all of it, not metaphorically inhabiting the grove, but literally constituting it. Her essence expressed in the biological signature of a place that now carries her identity in its most fundamental properties. If you have the Isma's tear, the droplet of essence that the grove contains and that the night can receive from Isma's transformed presence, the acid of the waterways does not harm you at all. Not in the grove, not anywhere. You carry her protection with you, a piece of what she became, encapsulated in a single droplet of bioessence that functions as a physical record of what Isma chose. Her protection extends beyond her body, beyond the grove, through the night itself, because the night received it, and the night carries it. This is the most elaborate and most permanent expression of a guardian's commitment in all of Hollow Night. Not fighting until death, not sleeping at an anchor point, not retreating into dormancy, becoming the protected thing itself, in a way that makes the protection indistinguishable from the presence of the place being protected. There is no longer a warrior and a grove. There is simply a grove that once contained a warrior, and the distinction between those two things has been dissolved by the completeness of the giving. Was it a choice? This is the question the lore leaves open, in the way Hollow Night leaves its most important questions open, present, visible, unanswerable from the information available, requiring you to sit with the uncertainty. The transformation is so complete, so thorough, so biologically final that it is difficult to imagine it happening without intention. The grove wouldn't have simply absorbed a night accidentally. The change required something that resembled consent, a willingness at minimum to be changed, a decision not to resist the process that the grove, the tree, the particular quality of this place was capable of producing in a being devoted enough to it. At the same time, the crisis created circumstances that may have made the transformation less a free choice than a necessary one. The infection was spreading. The waterways were becoming increasingly dangerous. The grove's function as the only passage to the ancient basin and the regions below it made protecting it not a matter of preference, but of structural necessity to anyone who still cared about the possibility of Hallownest's healing. If a conventional warrior's defence was insufficient, if the acid and the creatures of the waterways and the spreading corruption together amounted to a challenge that no sword-bearing guardian could adequately address, then perhaps what the situation required was something more than a sword-bearer, something that could make the environment itself the protection. Isma became the environment. She is still there. This is the fact that makes her story different from Drya's and Hegemal's in its emotional register. The others are gone. Drya fallen, Hegemal sleeping and separated from his armour, Zima grieving in the waterway's shadows, Ogrim holding his post in a chamber that makes less sense with each passing year. Isma is present, not as a knight, not in any form that resembles what she was before the transformation, but as an organism, as a great tree, and the warmth it generates, and the particular acidic neutrality that makes the grove accessible in a way nothing else around it is. She guards the passage still. The waterways still require the Isma's tear to navigate without damage. She's still performing the function she was assigned to perform, in the form that the assignment ultimately required her to take. There is something in this that contains both tragedy and a strange kind of wholeness, the tragedy of irrevocability, of a becoming that cannot be undone, and the wholeness of a commitment so fully realized that it dissolved the distinction between the person and the purpose. She is Isma's grove. The grove is Isma. The night carries a droplet of her, and where the night goes, something of what she became goes with it, protecting through the acid-flooded paths of a kingdom that needed protecting. Rest, Isma, or grow, which is what rest looks like for something that became a tree. Feel the roots spreading through the stone. Feel the warmth of the grove radiating outward. The passage is still safe. The ancient basin is still reachable. You are still doing what you gave everything to do. The fourth of the 5 great knights is Zama, and Zama is the one whose story is told almost entirely in the space of what has been lost. We know very little about who Zama was at the height of her service. This is deliberate, a choice by the game's design to make her a figure encountered primarily in the aftermath of something rather than in the thing itself, a person understood through what she is carrying in the ruins rather than through what she was in the kingdom. The evidence of who she was as a knight has the quality of a silence that knows what it is not saying. The silence of a life that existed vividly and completely, and is now present only in the emotional weight of what it left behind. She is called the Grey Mourner. That is the name the game gives her when you encounter her in the royal waterways, a cloaked, still figure standing in a corner of that dangerous underground pipe system. Her clothes the colour of grief's particular grey. Her posture, the posture of something that has been in the same place for a long time and has stopped moving because moving leads toward things she is not ready to encounter. She's not obviously a great knight. She does not introduce herself by that title. She does not explain her history, or her former role, or what happened between the height of the kingdom and this quiet corner of the waterways where she now stands. She asks you to carry a flower. The flower is a delicate pale bloom of a kind that does not exist in the natural palette of the royal waterways. Fragile, specifically fragile, susceptible to any damage, shattering if the knight takes a single hit, or vanishing if you attempt to fast travel anywhere. It is the pale king's flower, one of the specific anomalous blooms that simply appear in the world, unexplained, present in defiance of the environmental logic that should prevent them, She has one. She wants it carried to the grave of someone she loved in the Queen's Gardens, across terrain that does not make the carrying easy, through enemies that do not care about the delicacy of what you are carrying, through passages that test the patience and precision of anyone who attempts the journey with something breakable in hand. The quest is one of the most beloved optional experiences in all of Hollow Knight, because of what it communicates about Zima and about grief and about what remains when everything that could be taken has been taken. Think about who Zima was before she was the Grey Mourner. She was a great knight, one of 5 beings the Pale King considered his finest, someone with the capability and the character to stand among the group that also numbered Drya and Ogrim and Isma and Hegemol. She was capable of extraordinary things. She protected things worth protecting. She made choices in service of a kingdom that, at the time of her greatest ability, was still something that made those choices feel meaningful. And then the infection came, and the kingdom fell, and someone she loved did not survive. The lore does not name the person Zima loved. It does not tell us what their relationship was, what specific form the love took, how long it had been, and whether it had the quality of something long established, or something still discovering itself when the crisis swept it away. The game knows that some losses are made more precise by the specificity of names, and some losses are made more universal by their namelessness, and it chooses the latter here. We don't know who is buried in the Queen's Gardens. We know only that Zima loved them, and that they are there, and that Zima cannot reach them herself. Why can't she? This is the question whose answer the game withholds as carefully as it withholds the name. Perhaps the gardens are impassable to her now, the Traitor Lord's presence and its consequences having sealed the approaches in ways that Zima, without whatever capability she once had at full strength, cannot overcome. Perhaps the grief itself has become the barrier, the specific gravitational weight of loss that makes some places impossible to approach, not because of physical obstacles, but because approaching them would require a kind of facing that has not yet become possible. Perhaps she is carrying something, some wound, some diminishment, some consequence of whatever happened to her during the infection spread, that makes the journey physically prohibitive in ways we cannot see from outside her. The game leaves this open and focuses instead on what Zima has, the flower and the desire to send it. The love that cannot reach its object directly and finds the only remaining route, through a stranger, through the small, careful, precise act of asking someone else to carry what she cannot carry. This is what makes the quest so affecting. It asks you to do something objectively small. One flower, one destination, one journey through terrain you have presumably already navigated, at least partially. But the context makes the smallness enormous. Zima was a great knight. Whatever she once carried, whatever she once protected and fought for and stood in front of with the full commitment of someone who had decided that this was the function of her life, she's now asking you to carry a flower carefully. The whole of her former capability has been distilled by loss and time and the particular compression that grief applies to everything into this one small gesture. All the power, all the history, all the years of serving a kingdom she believed in, concentrated into a pale bloom that cannot survive a single hit. You carry it. If you are careful, very careful, attentive in a way that makes you slow and deliberate through terrain, your muscle memory has taught you to move through quickly, you can get it there. And when you arrive at the grave in the Queen's Gardens, the flower is placed, and something in the quality of the scene changes in the way that the right gesture always changes the quality of the space it fills. Zima cannot be at the grave, but the flower is there. The love that the flower represents is there, Something of what she feels for whoever lies beneath that stone is there, transmitted through a silent stranger who barely understands what they are carrying, placed at a destination that Zima has been unable to reach herself. This is love at the end of everything, not triumphant, not resolved, not at peace. Not the love that saves anything or changes the outcome or restores what has been lost. Love as the most minimal possible thing that can still be love. The insistence on finding some way, any way, to communicate across a gap that cannot be closed. A flower, a grave. A stranger asked to carry something breakable through a hostile world. When you return to Zima, she receives you with something in her response that can only be described as gratitude at the frequency of relief. The errand was completed. The flower arrived. Whatever it means to her to know that the bloom reached the grave, that the communication was made, that the gesture arrived at its destination, that meaning is visible in the quality of her stillness after the quest resolves. She does not become happy. This is not the kind of loss that resolves into happiness. She becomes a little less alone in her carrying of it. The grief has been witnessed, in its own specific and indirect way, by the knight who carried the flower, and witnessing, in some stories, is the closest thing to healing that the available world can provide. Zima, whose full name we have from lore glosses, was once called Zima of the Grey Morning, a title that names both the quality of her grief and the identity she has built around it in the absence of everything else. She was a great knight, and she became a mourner, and in the space between those two identities is the whole story of what the infection cost. Not in statistics, not in the count of hollowed citizens or ruined districts, but in the specific personal arithmetic of a person whose capability was legendary, and who now stands in a corner of the waterways asking strangers to carry her grief to a grave she cannot visit. Some losses are too large to survive whole. Zima survived in pieces, and the piece that remained was love, which is the piece that was always most fundamental, and which the infection, and the crisis, and the loss of everything else could diminish, but not eliminate. Sleep, Zima, or mourn, which is the form that sleep takes for someone whose dreams are haunted by faces. Know that the flower is at the grave. Know that the love arrived. The gap could not be closed entirely, but it was spanned for a moment by the smallest and most precise gesture available. It was enough. It was more than enough. The last of the 5 great knights is Ogrim, and Ogrim is different from all of the others in a way that the other differences between the 5 do not prepare you for. Ogrim is still himself. This is the most important thing about him, and it is not a small thing in the context of Hallownest's ruins, where the crisis has transformed everyone remaining into something harder to recognise, hollowed or grieving or sleeping or dissolved into the substance of a grove, or losing his armour to creatures that found it in the dark. Ogrim is in the royal waterways, in a chamber he has been maintaining in his own specific way, and he is still Ogrim, still the same being he was before the infection, before the kingdom fell, before the 5 great knights became 5 separate endings to 5 separate stories. He is carrying everything that has happened, the loss of his kingdom and his king and his fellow knights, and he is doing it while remaining incontrovertibly himself. He is also admittedly doing it in a chamber that he has been slowly filling with refuse. This requires explanation. When you find Ogrim in the waterways, the chamber he has occupied is not pristine. It is not the orderly headquarters of a great warrior who has found a sustainable position from which to maintain a defensive posture. It is full of waste material, the accumulated discards of the waterways, collected and deposited in Ogrim's chamber, apparently through some process that Ogrim has had a hand in. He's been bringing waste into this room, or allowing it to accumulate there, or, in some mode of action that the game leaves to your imagination, actively involved in the management of waste as though this is a task worth performing. This sounds, described plainly, absurd, and there is something absurd about it. The lore acknowledges this, the game's design acknowledges this. The specific nature of Ogrim's situation invites you to see both the pathos and the gentle comedy of a great warrior who has found a purpose in the most humble available material. He is doing what he was built to do, serving, guarding, maintaining, in the only domain in which those functions are still available to him, which happens to be considerably less dignified than the domains he used to serve in. But underneath the surface absurdity, Ogrim's situation is the most emotionally straightforward of all the 5 great knights, because Ogrim has the clearest relationship to his own loss. He knows what happened. He knows the kingdom is gone. He knows the Pale King is gone, that his fellow knights are gone or transformed or sleeping, that the function he devoted his life to has no kingdom left to be devoted to. He knows all of this, and he has not stopped. He has found something, anything, that approximates the function, and he is doing that thing with the full commitment he has always brought to everything he has done, because stopping is not something Ogrim knows how to be. The lore and the community have long understood Ogrim as the most openly warm of the 5 great knights, where Drya's devotion was precise and purposeful, where Hegemal's endurance was patient and vast, where Isma's caring was expressed in the most literal possible giving of self. Ogrim's warmth is direct and unmediated. He does not filter his enthusiasm through irony or professionalism, or the particular cool that some warriors adopt as a mode of presenting themselves to a world that might otherwise mistake warmth for weakness. He is what he is, completely without apology. He is glad. He is enthusiastic. He finds things magnificent. He calls things glorious with the specific frequency of someone for whom magnificence and glory are genuine experiences rather than performative categories. When he encounters the knight, first in combat, then in the aftermath of combat, his response to both stages is authentic in a way that would be jarring if it were not so evidently genuine. He fights with full commitment because fighting the knight is a real test, and Ogrim does not do anything at less than full capacity. He loses and calls you glorious because you won a genuine fight, and being beaten by someone genuinely better than you is, in Ogrim's framework, a form of honour rather than humiliation. This is the quality that made him one of the 5 great knights, and it is the quality that has kept him surviving in the ruins in a way that the others have not been able to maintain. Ogrim has not been hollowed by the crisis because the crisis has not been able to hollow him. Not because he is more powerful than it, not because he has found a solution that the others missed, but because the thing the infection targets, the interior life, the self, the specific quality of being that makes a mind something the Radiance's light can find and fill and consume, is in Ogrim too robust, too dense, too thoroughly itself to be easily hollowed out. Some selves are built of such unalloyed material that the kind of pressure that dissolves complexity simply finds nothing to dissolve. Ogrim is not complex in the mode of sophisticated ambivalence. He is not complicated by regret or qualification, or the self-interrogating distance from his own experience that produces the particular fragility of a very self-aware person. He is what he is without remainder, and what he is without remainder is someone warm, someone loyal, someone committed to his function, with a totality that leaves no gap for the infection to enter through. He stayed. When others retreated or transformed or fell, Ogrim stayed in Hallownest. He found a chamber and he settled in it, and he began doing the only thing available, and the kingdom's ruins have him. But his loneliness is the thing that the game allows you to feel, even as it preserves his genuine self intact. He's alone in that chamber in the waterways, not temporarily alone in the specific lasting way of someone who has been without company for long enough that the absence has become the baseline of experience rather than a deviation from it. The other knights are gone, his king is gone, the citizens who might have been his people are hollowed or dead or fled to whatever safety remains outside the underground. The function he devoted his life to, the protection of something worth protecting, the active service of a kingdom alive enough to require and receive that service, has no current object. He is a guardian with nothing left to guard except a chamber full of refuse and a belief, unshakable and possibly irrational, that this is not the end. He believes, or behaves as though he believes, that the Pale King will return, that the kingdom will be restored, that the 5 great knights will have their function back, and that the half-remembered glory of Hallownest will reconstitute itself around the principles that originally produced it. Whether this is genuine belief, or the coping framework of someone who cannot survive without a structure of meaning that the current reality no longer provides, the game does not adjudicate. Ogrim holds the belief with the same full commitment he brings to everything else, and whether the belief is warranted, it is functional. It keeps him moving, it keeps him present, it keeps him himself. When the night arrives, something happens in Ogrim's response to that encounter that reads, if you're paying attention to the emotional register rather than the surface events, like the specific exhale of someone for whom something has finally happened. Not the right thing, not the thing he was waiting for. The Pale King has not returned, the kingdom has not been restored, the 5 great knights have not reassembled, but something. Someone capable. Someone who moves through the waterways with the quality of a being on a genuine errand. Someone who tests him in the combat and defeats him and accepts the reality of the result without shame. Someone who is doing something. After the fight, his response to the night carries the texture of someone choosing, actively and deliberately, to interpret this encounter as a good sign. Because Ogrim needs it to be a good sign, and because he is the kind of being for whom need and interpretive charity are not in conflict, who can look at the evidence available and find the most hopeful reading without experiencing that reading as dishonest. The night is here. The night is capable. The night is moving towards something. This is enough for now. This is enough to sustain the function for a little longer. Ogrim, the most loyal of the 5 great knights, sits in his chamber in the royal waterways, enormous and warm and slightly absurd and utterly intact, and he waits for the world to need him again in the specific way he was built to be needed. He should not have to wait alone. He should not be in a chamber of refuse rather than a hall of knights, his king missing, his companions dispersed into their various endings. He should not be here at all, should be somewhere the size of his capacity actually has room to be expressed, somewhere his warmth has someone to be warm toward, somewhere his loyalty has a kingdom to be loyal to. But he is here, and he is still himself, and in a game full of people who have been transformed by, or consumed by, or lost to the crisis. That is the most remarkable thing about him. Ogrim, unchanged, in the ruins, still the thing he was when Hallownest was new, and the Pale King was building something worth protecting, and the 5 great knights stood in a half-circle at the centre of it all, knowing each other, serving together, alive in the fullness of what they were made to be. Sleep, Ogrim, or don't sleep. Ogrim probably wouldn't sleep, would stay awake and alert in his chamber, ready for whatever comes next, the most wakeful guardian in a kingdom of the dormant. Rest then in whatever mode rest takes for someone who finds resting difficult. The kingdom is quiet. The Pale King is at peace on his throne in the dream. The 5 great knights have each found their ending. Yours is not over yet. There is something that needs to be said about what the 5 great knights meant as a collective, as an institution, as an organizational fact of the Pale King's kingdom, before we let them rest individually. The Pale King built Hallownest around a set of principles, not principles in the abstract sense of values written into a founding document, but principles in the structural sense, organizing beliefs that shaped how institutions were built, how functions were assigned, how the kingdom understood its own identity in relation to the threats and opportunities the world presented to it. The mind gift was the most fundamental of these principles, the belief that consciousness was worth giving, that the capacity for understanding and self-reflection was a genuine good that enhanced, rather than complicated, the lives of the creatures who received it. But the mind gift, for all its transformative power, created as many vulnerabilities as it addressed. Conscious creatures can be hollowed in ways that simple, instinctual creatures cannot. They can be infected through their dreams, reach through the spaces that awareness inevitably creates, made into vehicles for the spread of something that targets the very quality that makes them sophisticated. The Pale King understood this, understood that the gift of mind was also the gift of susceptibility, that you cannot give creatures the capacity for the fullness of experience without also giving them exposure to the fullness of everything experience can carry. The 5 great knights were his answer to the physical dimension of that vulnerability, not the metaphysical, psychic, dream realm vulnerability that the infection represented at its most fundamental, that required the vessels and the dreamers and the entire elaborate apparatus of the Black Egg Temple seal. But the physical, immediate tactical vulnerability of a kingdom that had living citizens who could be threatened by living threats, by other beings acting out of their own agendas, by the ordinary violence of a world where being powerful and conspicuous attracts the attention of everything that wants what the powerful and conspicuous are protecting. The 5 great knights were how Hallownest kept itself safe in the physical world. Each of them expressed the protective function differently, because the Pale King was wise enough to understand that protection is not a single thing. Protection requires endurance, and it requires precision, and it requires the capacity to become the thing you are protecting when fighting for it, is no longer enough. It requires loyalty specific enough to sustain when the object of loyalty is gone, and warmth sufficient to remain warm when the world has become cold enough to extinguish most things. Each of the 5 expressed one of these qualities in its most complete form. Together, they constituted the fullest possible expression of protective capability, a combination that made Hallownest more resistant to the threats the world offered than any single warrior, no matter how individually extraordinary, could have managed alone. This is what the Pale King built. Not a standing army, not a hierarchy of functionaries, but 5 specific people, whose specific qualities complemented each other in ways that made the whole substantially more than the sum of its parts. Hegemal's wall, Dryer's blade, Isma's transformation, Zama's love, Ogrim's warmth, each essential, each irreplaceable in its particular mode. And then the infection came, and the thing they were protecting was threatened in a way that their physical capabilities could not fully address. And each of them found their way of facing that impossibility. Some of those ways were more successful than others. None of them fully succeeded, because nothing fully succeeded against the infection. The kingdom fell regardless. The Pale King retreated and died in his dream palace. The Hollow Knight endured but could not hold the seal forever. But each of the 5 great knights faced the failure of everything they had been built to do with the equipment of their own character, and that facing is the most honest and most human thing that any of them do in all of Hollow Knight's enormous cast of honest and human characters. Let us talk about what the ruins of the kingdom preserve of them. The ruins of Hallownest are one of the most carefully designed memorial environments in all of video games. Every room, every environmental detail, every enemy placement and architecture choice, and hidden note contains the memory of something that was here and is no longer here in the same way. Moving through Hallownest is the experience of reading a record, not a written record, not a library's organised archive, though Monoman's Teacher's Archives is that too, but a physical record. A record of lived experience written in stone and water and shadow, and the specific shapes that things take when they have been in a place long enough to leave an impression. The 5 great knights are part of that record. Hegemal's impression is the armour in the ancient basin. Drya's impression is the Traitor Lord boss fight in the Queen's Gardens, the evidence of the battle that her death was the losing of. Isma's impression is the grove itself, the warm anomaly in the hostile waterways, the tree that is more than a tree and the acid that doesn't burn where she is present. Zima's impression is the flower quest and the grey-cloaked figure in the waterways, and the grave in the gardens where a pale bloom sits in the quiet. Ogrim's impression is himself, the living record, the unbroken continuation, the great knight still present in the ruins that the others have only left marks in. Each of these impressions tells you something different about the nature of loss and what survives it. Hegemal's armour teaches you that the externally visible aspects of a person can persist without the person, that the shell can endure when the self that wore it has retreated to somewhere the shell cannot follow. There is a particular loneliness in this kind of survival, the loneliness of a reputation or a title or a role that continues to be occupied by the world even after the personality has withdrawn from it. Hegemal's armour is doing Hegemal's job. Hegemal's not there to do Hegemal's job. The work continues, and the worker is absent, and the absence is the more real of the two. Dria's impression, the boss fight with the Traitor Lord, the vulnerability of the gardens that her fall created, teaches you that some kinds of protection are only as lasting as the protector is alive. There is no residue of Dria in the gardens beyond the evidence of her having failed to hold them. She was entirely present while she was present, and when she was not present, there was nothing left of her protection. This is the limitation of the direct, active, combat-based mode of protection. It requires the protector's continued presence. It cannot be deputed or automated or made ambient. It is while the knight is there, and it is not while the knight is not. Isma's impression teaches you the opposite, that protection can be made so thoroughly ambient, so thoroughly constitutive of the environment itself, that it persists in forms that do not require the protector's continued personhood. Isma is in the grove in a way that will last as long as the grove exists. The Isma's tear that the knight carries will resist acid wherever the knight goes, long after Isma herself has dissolved into the biology of a great tree and a warm enclosed space in the hostile waterways. The protection has been made structural rather than personal, and structural protections are more durable than personal ones, though they require more of the person who creates them. Zema's impression teaches you that love outlasts everything else. Not the capability, not the function, not the combat ability or the tactical skill or the physical presence that made her a great knight worth naming among the 5. those things diminished in whatever way they diminished in the interval between the kingdom's height and the ruins the knight walks through. What remained was the love for someone specific, the specific, stubborn, specific love that cannot accept pure loss, that insists on finding some gesture of continued communication even when the communicative distance has become almost unbridgeable. The flower to the grave, the most minimal expression of love that is still love, sustained past everything that should have extinguished it by the sheer refusal of love to be the thing that goes. Ogrim's impression teaches you simply, and most powerfully, some things endure because they are too essentially themselves to be changed. Ogrim in the ruins is Ogrim. There is no gap between the knight he was at Hallownest's height and the being he is in the waterway's chamber surrounded by refuse. The same warmth, the same directness, the same authentic commitment, the same willingness to fight with full capacity and call you glorious when you win. He is unchanged, not unchanged because nothing happened to him. Everything that happened to the kingdom happened to Ogrim too, and the loss is visible in his situation, in the loneliness of his position, in the specific poignancy of a great knight who has found no function equal to what he was built for, but unchanged in himself. The infection has found no gap in him to enter through, because there is no gap in him. He is fully himself all the way through. There is something that needs to be said about the Pale King's relationship to the 5 great knights, specifically and individually, before we let this story come to its rest. He chose them, not as one chooses tools, not by evaluating capability against requirements and selecting the items that best meet the specification. He chose them the way someone chooses the people they trust to stand at the centre of something they have built and love. Not simply on the basis of what each of them could do, but on the basis of what each of them was, the orientation they had toward their function, the beliefs that made the function meaningful to them, the specific way each of them embodied something that the Pale King understood as essential to what Hallownest needed to be. He gave each of them an assignment that matched who they were. He gave Hegemol the most demanding endurance role, the position that required staying and absorbing and being present for as long as presence was required. He gave Drea the most direct and personal role, the protection not of territories or institutions but of the king himself, the most intimate form of the protective function. He gave Isma the role that would require eventually the most total giving of self, the guardianship of the passage that connected the kingdom's surface to its depths. He gave Zima, and here the assignment is less clear, the lore more fragmentary, but the implication is of a role suited to someone whose love made them particularly suited to protecting the things that were hardest to protect, the most vulnerable and the most essential. And he gave Ogrim the role that Ogrim's specific warmth made him best suited for. The visible, vocal, enthusiastic presence of a knight who makes the kingdom feel defended, not just by the fact of defence, but by the quality of it. The Pale King, who built Hallownest from the mind gift outward, who understood consciousness well enough to give it to thousands of creatures who had not previously possessed it, also understood the 5 great knights well enough to see what each of them was, and to give each of them an assignment that could become the truest expression of what they were. This is the mark of a builder who understands that the most powerful force in any structure is not the raw strength of its materials, but the precision with which the right material is placed in the right position. He placed them well. Each of the 5 became, through the assignment the Pale King gave them, more fully themselves than they might have become without it. The assignment did not create the quality. It recognized it, named it, gave it a context in which it could be expressed at its fullest scale. And when the infection came, and the assignments failed to hold against a threat that physical protection could not fully address, each of them carried the quality that had distinguished them into the failure, into the specific, character-expressive way that each of them met the crisis. Hegemol withdrew into the deep endurance of dormancy, the most extreme version of the patience that had always been his primary quality. Drea fought to the end of what fighting could accomplish, which is exactly what someone whose commitment was total and whose mode was direct combat would do. Isma gave everything in the most literal sense, because giving was always her tendency toward the absolute. Zima carried the grief rather than putting it down, because her love was the most fundamental thing about her, and love in the mode she experienced it does not know how to put itself down. Ogrim waited, warm and undiminished, in the ruins, because Ogrim does not know how to stop being Ogrim. The Pale King is gone. The kingdom is gone. The 5 great knights have found their various endings, some of them more final than others, some of them more complete, some of them more comfortable. But what each of them was, the quality that distinguished them, the specific orientation toward existence that made the Pale King choose them, and the kingdom worth defending, and the assignments expressions of their truest selves, that remains, in the armour in the ancient basin, in the warmth of Isma's grove, in the grey-cloaked figure and the pale flower, in the most loyal, most intact, most fully himself warrior sitting in a chamber in the waterways, waiting for the world to need him again. They were Hallownest's finest, the most complete expressions of what a knight can be, each in their own mode, each in the specific vocabulary of their own character. The Pale King knew what he had in them, and the ruins of his kingdom preserve what they were with the fidelity that only physical evidence, untranslatable and unalterable, can provide. They're still there. They're still who they were. The crisis and the fall have taken so much from Hallownest, hollowed so many minds and broken so many structures, and dissolved so many relationships into the erasure that the infection produces in everything it touches. But the 5 great knights were not dissolved. They were transformed and scattered and isolated and separated from the context that gave their function meaning. But they were not dissolved. Each of them remains in the specific form that their character made available to them, in the ruins of the thing they served. This is not comfort exactly. It is not the ending that any of them deserved, or that the kingdom deserved, or that the citizens who were uplifted with the mind gift and built the City of Tears and staffed the Soul Sanctum and travelled the stag routes deserved. The correct ending would have been Hallownest intact and the 5 great knights still at their stations and Hegemol's armour on Hegemol, and Zima in a place that is not a shadowed corner of a hostile waterway. But it is what remained, and what remained is evidence. Evidence that they were real, that their qualities were real, that the specific and irreducible things that made each of them irreplaceable, the patience, the precision, the total giving, the love that would not let go, the warmth that could not be hollowed, were real things that existed in the world, that shaped the shape of the world around them, that left impressions in stone and water and tree and armour, and the presence of a great warm knight who is still, even now, entirely himself. Here is what I want you to take with you into sleep. The 5 great knights of Hallownest were not paragons. They were people, or people-shaped, consciousness-bearing beings, which is the nearest the underground has to people, with specific qualities and specific loves and specific ways of facing the most difficult circumstances that those qualities and loves were capable of producing. they served a king who was attempting something genuinely extraordinary, and who failed in ways that were catastrophic and perhaps unavoidable, and certainly irreversible. They gave their various versions of everything in service of that attempt. And when the attempt failed, as it always seemed in retrospect positioned to fail, they faced the failure in the exact mode of themselves. Hegemol with endurance, Drea with commitment, Isma with the totality of giving, Zima with love, Ogrim with warmth. These are not small things. They are the most essential things available to conscious beings in the face of loss. The specific, personal, character-expressive modes of continuing to be something, of remaining in the ruins, the thing you were before the ruins, or something that the ruins have transformed without dissolving, of not becoming nothing, even when everything around you has become something closer to nothing than it has any right to be. The City of Tears is quiet now. The royal waterways carry their acid through the corridors below it. Isma's grove is warm at the heart of the hostile pipes. The Queen's gardens grow their anomalous flowers in the wrong colours for the underground. The ancient basin lies beyond the sealed passages, silent and deep, holding the memory of a palace that no longer exists in the physical world. The resting grounds mark their graves with the careful geometric memorial language of a culture that understood death as a thing worth organising the living's relationship to. And somewhere in the deep stone, Hegemol sleeps. And somewhere in the memory of the gardens, Drea's ending is preserved in the evidence of the battle she fought. And in the warmth of Isma's grove, a tree breathes in and out in the slow pulse of something that is very old and has no intention of stopping. And in the shadowed waterways, Zima stands with her grief and her love, and the stubborn insistence on expressing that love even when expression requires a stranger to carry something fragile through a hostile world. And in a chamber in those same waterways, Ogrim waits, entirely himself for whatever comes next. They are still the 5 great knights. Not as they were at the height of Hallownest, not with the kingdom intact and the Pale King on his throne, and the function of their service clear and present and every quality they possessed, finding its fullest expression in the protection of something worth protecting, but still themselves, still the specific, irreducible things that made them great knights rather than simply knights. Still carrying the qualities that the Pale King recognised and named and assigned and trusted, and which the ruins of his kingdom preserve, with the fidelity of physical evidence, against the possibility of being forgotten. They should not be forgotten. Sleep now. The Pale King's kingdom is quiet. The 5 great knights have found their places in the silence. The armour still in the basin, the grove still warm in the waterways, the flower still at the grave, the loyal warrior still waiting in the dark for whatever calls him next. The darkness of the underground is very old and very wide, and it holds all of them. Let yourself fall toward it. Let the weight of your body ground you in the specific, physical, irreplaceable fact of yourself. Let the blanket's gravity be enough. The 5 great knights held what they could hold, for as long as they could hold it, in the specific mode of who they were. This is all any of us can do. This is everything we can do. And it is in the end sufficient. Not to save everything, not to prevent all the loss or heal all the harm or restore what the crisis took, but sufficient to be something in the ruins of what was, that the ruins preserve as evidence of what was real. They were real. Hegemol, patient and vast in his armour that endures without him. Drea, precise and total in her final stand. Isma, wholly given, in the warm tree and the acid-resistant air. Zerma, loving and bereaved, in the flower and the grieving and the grey. Ogrim, warm and undiminished, still at his post, real, specific, irreducible, preserved. Sleep now. The kingdom is quiet. The 5 great knights are in their places, each of them exactly where the specific quality of their character brought them, each of them an impression of something genuine left in the stone of a world that has been hollowed of so much but has not been hollowed of them. The darkness waits. The dream is already there, below this moment, patient as the void at the bottom of the abyss, older than memory, waiting for you to fall into it. You're not alone in the quiet. The great knights are still in the deep stone, each in their own form of remaining, and the fact of their endurance, the stubbornness with which each of them, in their own mode, refuse to be nothing, is the most quietly hopeful thing the ruins of Hallownest have to offer. Let that hope carry you downward, into the dark which is not empty, into the quiet which is not silence, into the sleep which is not absence. Sleep now. The 5 great knights keep their watch. Rest. There is one more dimension of the 5 great knights that has not yet been addressed, and it is the dimension that the lore presents most quietly, and that requires the most reconstruction from available evidence. The dimension of what they were to each other. They knew each other. This seems obvious, but it is worth stating because the way we have been speaking about them, one at a time, each enclosed in their own story, each an individual narrative of quality and loss, does not capture what it meant to be part of a group of 5 people who were each, in their own mode, extraordinary. The 5 great knights were not simply 5 separate individuals who happened to share a title. They were a cohort, a company, a group that was formed, over time, into something more specific than the sum of its members by the shared experience of being, together, the highest expression of Hallownest's protective capability. What did they know of each other? The lore does not give us scenes of the 5 gathered together, no council chamber where they met, no shared feast where their different personalities illuminated each other in conversation. Hollow Knight does not work that way. What it gives is the evidence. Characters who, when encountered in the ruins, respond to the world in ways that suggest a history of having been among others who were their equals, who carry themselves with the specific quality of people who have been recognized by very good judges. Ogrim called Drya magnificent. Almost certainly. It is impossible to imagine Ogrim not calling Drya magnificent in the specific, genuine, unironic way he calls everything that really is magnificent by that name. She was precise and committed, and the Pale King's most trusted personal protector, which is exactly the kind of person who earns Ogrim's enthusiastic recognition. And she almost certainly received it with the cool, professional grace of someone who accepts recognition without needing it, which is the specific combination that makes Ogrim's enthusiasm not annoying but endearing. He gives it freely to people who are not performing for it, and the giving is therefore honest. Hegemol and Isma were probably, in the vocabulary of this particular group, the steadiest pair, both of them oriented toward their functions in a way that made the function feel less like a job and more like an expression of nature. Hegemol's endurance and Isma's total giving are different expressions of the same fundamental quality, the willingness to be completely available to what is required of you, without reservation, for as long as it is required. In each other, they would have recognized something that requires very little explanation, the specific recognition of people who share a deep structural similarity, even when the surface manifestations of that similarity are completely different. Zima, in the fullness of what she was before the loss she now carries, would have been what? The law preserves her primarily in grief, but grief is a response to something that was vivid. You do not grieve at the frequency Zema grieves without having loved fully, and you do not love fully without having been, before the love was taken, someone for whom love was a primary mode of being in the world. Zema loved the person buried in the gardens with the totality of someone for whom love was as natural a quality as Hegemol's endurance or Ogrim's warmth. In the company of the five, she would have been the one most likely to see the others clearly, to know their depths and their difficulties, to care about them not simply as colleagues but as people. They were a community. This is the word that the law earns even in its fragmentary state. A community of five extraordinary individuals who shared a context, a function, a king, and a way of understanding what mattered and why. The specific community of the five great knights was Hallownest's most concentrated gathering of genuine quality. Not talent, not raw capability, but the thing that capability in service of something believed in becomes when it has been expressed consistently for long enough. Character. They had each other's characters. They had the specific knowledge of the other four that only companionship over time can produce. The knowledge of who Hegemol was when nothing was required of him, what Drya's humour was like when she was not being the king's protector, how Isma's gentleness expressed itself in company rather than simply in the act of giving herself to a grove. They had all of this, and then the crisis came, and the company dissolved into its separate endings, and what each of them carried into those endings was not just the loss of the kingdom, but the loss of each other. This is the grief that runs beneath the grief that is visible in each of their stories. Zema grieves the person she loved, yes, but she also grieves the company she was part of. Ogrim, warm and loyal in his waterway's chamber, is warm and loyal toward an emptiness. Not the absence of a king, but the absence of the four other people who knew what he was and were known by him in return. The loneliness of the five great knights' various endings is not simply the loneliness of separation from their function. It is the loneliness of people who knew each other, genuinely and specifically, and who have been separated by circumstances that could not be negotiated with. The kingdom fell. The five of them could not fall together, and so each found their own ending, alone. Hegemol sleeping without his armour, Drya dying in the gardens without her companions beside her, Isma becoming the grove in solitude, Zema mourning in the waterways, Ogrim waiting in his chamber with no one to wait with. They had been a five. The crisis made them five separate ones, and the distance between a 5 and 5 ones is everything. Not mathematical, but experiential. Not the count of members, but the quality of what exists between members when the number is right. There is a place in the game's late content, accessible through the God Home, the grand arena that exists in the dream realm for beings who have transcended the ordinary challenges of the physical world, where the 5 great knights can be encountered again. Not as ruins or residues or transformed presences, but as something more complete, as dream versions of themselves at the peak of their power, summoned by the logic of the pantheons into the arena to test whoever comes. The pantheons of Hallownest are the Godmaster content, a layer of the game that exists outside the main narrative's temporal logic, in the dream realm's own version of an eternal arena where the most powerful beings who have ever existed in or passed through Hallownest are gathered as challenges. This is not history. It is something closer to essence. The void heart-bearing knight, moving through tiers of increasingly demanding combat, facing the preserved ideal forms of Hallownest's greatest, including the 5. The 5 great knights appear in the pantheons at their full strength, not diminished by grief, not reduced by dormancy, not transformed into something ambient or hollowed by loneliness. They are what they were at the height of their service. Hegemol armoured and vast, Dryar precise and relentless. Isma present but in her most intense form. Zama fighting with a speed and grace that the grey-cloaked figure in the waterways gives no indication of, Ogrim thunderously committed, every strike and movement expressive of the fullness he brings to everything. This is the version of them that the physical world can no longer fully access, because the physical world is ruins, and the conditions that allowed these versions to exist have been irreversibly altered. But the dream realm preserves them. The Godhome and its pantheons exist as a space where the most complete versions of Hallownest's greatest beings are permanently available, not as memories, but as something closer to ideals, the pattern rather than the particular instantiation, accessible to anyone with the capability and determination to reach them. What does it mean that the 5 great knights exist in the pantheons at the height of their power, while the physical world contains only their aftermath? It means that what they were is not lost. The specific, irreducible quality of each of them, Hegemol's endurance, Dryar's precision, Isma's giving, Zima's love-made capacity, Ogrim's warmth, exists in the dream realm in the form of the challenge they present. To face Hegemol in the pantheons is to encounter not a memorial to what he was, but the actual thing, the full expression of a warrior whose commitment to the protective function is so complete that the dream realm has no difficulty finding the most powerful version of it and presenting it without diminishment. The pantheons are, in this reading, the most honest memorial Hallownest has. Not the ruins, which preserve only the aftermath, and not the graves, which preserve only the absence, but the dream realm's version of an arena where the greatest beings of the underground are exactly what they were at their best, exactly as powerful as the best of themselves required them to be, fighting with the full commitment that made them worth remembering in the first place. You face them there, and in facing them, in testing yourself against the fullest expression of Hegemol's endurance, in meeting Dryar's precision with whatever precision you have developed, in encountering the power of what Zama was before grief became the primary fact of her existence, you participate in the most complete possible act of remembrance. Not the remembrance of someone reading a memorial, the remembrance of someone actually engaging with the thing being remembered, actually encountering it, actually being tested by it. The pantheons do not forget what the physical world has lost. They preserve it in the most living form available, as a challenge that is still genuinely a challenge, not a recreation, not a commemoration. The actual thing accessed through the most extraordinary quality of the dream realm, its capacity to hold what was in its most intense form without diminishment and without the corrosion of time. Let us step back one more time and talk about what knighthood actually means, not as a title, not as a rank within a kingdom's hierarchy, but as an orientation toward existence. The word knight carries a great deal of baggage from the traditions it belongs to outside the world of Hollow Knight. In the medieval tradition that the title evokes, a knight is someone who has been formally recognised by an institution of authority as possessing the combination of physical capability, personal valour, and institutional loyalty that the institution considers worth elevating. The recognition is the thing, the ceremony, the title conferred, the armour that marks belonging to a knightly order, the code of conduct that defines the order's understanding of what a knight is supposed to be. The 5 great knights of Hallownest belong to this tradition in some ways and transcend it in others. They were recognised by the Pale King, formally acknowledged, numbered, named as a collective, and that recognition was the institutional moment that made them the 5 great knights as a category, rather than simply 5 very capable individuals. In this sense, they are exactly what the word implies. People elevated by institutional recognition to a specific status within a kingdom structure. But the Pale King's recognition was not the constitutive act. The recognition did not make them what they were. It named what they already were. The Pale King, who understood consciousness and its qualities with an intimacy that no other being in Hallownest possessed, looked at 5 individuals and saw in each of them a quality so complete, so thoroughly expressed, so genuinely present in every aspect of how they move through the world, that the word knight was the closest available name for it. Knighthood, in this understanding, is not a conferred status. It is a recognition of something already present. And what is present, in all 5 of them, in different forms, is a specific relationship to the protective function that transforms protecting from a job into an identity. Not protecting because they were paid to, not protecting because they were ordered to, not protecting in the mode of someone fulfilling a contract's terms, protecting because the thing to be protected was genuinely worth protecting, and because they had each, in their own mode of understanding value and commitment, recognized it as such, and committed themselves to it with the fullness of who they were. This is the difference between the 5 great knights and the ordinary warriors of Hallownest's army. The ordinary warriors were capable and dedicated and served an important function, and none of this diminishes them. But they protected Hallownest because protecting Hallownest was their role within a structure that made sense of their place in the kingdom. The 5 great knights protected Hallownest because they had decided, each in the private, irreducible language of their own character, that Hallownest was worth protecting. The decision preceded the role. The commitment preceded the assignment. The Pale King's recognition was the form the decision took in the external world, but the decision was prior to it, and more fundamental. This is why each of them, when the infection came and the structures of the kingdom began to fail, continued in the specific mode of their own character, rather than simply stopping when the role ceased to be sustainable. The role was not why they were doing it. The role was the institutional expression of something that survived the institution. Hegemol continued to endure because endurance was what he was, not because the kingdom's protocols for defensive positioning were still operable. Dryar continued to fight because fighting in defense of something she had decided was worth defending was the most fundamental expression of her identity, not because she expected to win. Isma gave everything because giving was the form her caring took, not because there was a strategic analysis suggesting that total transformation was the optimal outcome. And Ogrim continues to wait, because Ogrim's loyalty is not contingent on the continued existence of the thing it is loyal to. The loyalty is the thing, the Pale King, the kingdom, the 5 great knights. These were the objects that organized Ogrim's loyalty into a specific and legible form. The loyalty itself is prior to the objects. It would exist without them, in the way that certain fundamental qualities of character exist prior to and independent of the specific context that give them their most complete expression. This is what makes the 5 great knights more than warriors and more than characters in a story. They're each, in their own mode, demonstrations of what the most complete expression of a specific human quality looks like when it is given everything it needs, and then everything it needs is taken away, and the quality persists anyway, not because the conditions for it still exist, but because the quality was always more fundamental than the conditions: endurance, commitment, giving, love, warmth. 5 qualities, expressed to their fullest possible extent in 5 beings who had the capacity to express them that fully and the circumstances that required them to do so. 5 demonstrations of what it looks like when a person or a person-shaped consciousness is not diminished by loss but revealed by it, when the crisis strips away everything secondary and leaves only the most essential thing, and the most essential thing turns out to be exactly the thing the person always was. Sleep now, if you can feel the edge of it. The story of the 5 great nights is the story of 5 people who each, in their own way, hold a form of the same truth, that what we are in our most essential mode is not dependent on the persistence of the context that first gave that mode its fullest expression. That loss does not erase the quality which was the reason for the loss's weight. That Hegemol sleeping without his armour is still Hegemol, still the specific temperament that made the armour meaningful. That Drya dying in the gardens is still Drya, still the complete commitment that made the gardens worth dying in defence of. That Isma having become the grove is still Isma, still the giving so total that the distinction between giver and given dissolved. That Zima standing in the waterways with a flower she cannot carry herself is still Zima, still the love that cannot accept pure silence when a gesture remains possible. That Ogrim waiting in his chamber, warm and loyal in the ruins of everything, is still Ogrim, still the warmth that could not be hollowed. None of them needed the kingdom to still be standing to be what they are. The kingdom is gone, they remain, in different forms, in different conditions, in different states of completeness and wholeness and access to the function that originally gave their qualities their most vivid expression, but they remain. This is a specific kind of hope that Hollow Knight offers through the 5 great nights, separate from the more dramatic hope of the game's various endings and the fate of Hallownest's infection. It is the quieter hope of a game that understands loss deeply and wants you to understand it too, that the things that made the people you loved worth loving are not destroyed when those people are taken, that the qualities that define the relationships and the places and the versions of yourself that exist only in a past you can no longer inhabit are still real, are still present, are still findable in the evidence left behind, in the person you became because of them, in the impressions pressed into the stone of everything you walked through while they were with you. The 5 great nights left their impressions. The entire physical world of Hallownest is organised, in its current ruined state, by the traces of what they were. The grove is warm because Isma loved the thing she was protecting. The armour has weight because someone enormous and patient wore it for long enough to compress that patience into the physical material. The gardens grow their anomalous flowers because someone died defending them, and the White Lady still tends them because the White Lady has not stopped tending what she loves, and what Drya died defending the right for the White Lady to tend is still being tended. The flower is at the grave because love insisted on finding an expression even when the most direct expressions had been foreclosed. And in a waterway's chamber, the warmth of a great loyal knight who's been alone for years radiates outward into the hostile acid-flooded pipes and makes even the most dangerous part of the kingdom feel, for a moment, like somewhere that contains a person who is glad you arrived. The underground is quiet. The Pale King is at rest on his throne in the Dream Realm Palace. The Hollow Knight endures its vigil or has been released from it, depending on which ending the night achieved. The dreamers are freed from their seals. The world is in a particular stillness that follows every ending, that hangs in the space between what was and whatever comes next. that has the quality of a breath held not in anxiety, but in the specific, good suspension of someone who has set something heavy down and is feeling the absence of the weight. In that stillness, the 5 great knights are in their places, hegemon deep in the stone, sleeping in the patience that was always him. Dryar at peace in whatever form rest takes for someone who expressed herself fully and has no more to give. Isma warm in her grove, the roots spread patient and vast through the walls and floors of the underground, connected to everything she was assigned to protect and connecting it still. Zima with her grief, which is the shape that love takes when it has survived everything that love can survive, and is still here, still insisting. Ogrim awake and loyal in the waterways, the most alive figure in a world of ruins, the warmth of him spreading outward into the dark the way warmth always spreads, not because the dark deserves it, but because warmth does not know how to be less than what it is. Let yourself settle into the dark they are keeping their watch in. Let the undergrounds quiet. The particular quality of silence that exists this deep, where the sounds of the surface world do not reach, and even the sound of the rain in the city of tears is too far above to be heard, become the sound of where you are right now, the weight of your body in the bed, the specific temperature of the room, the texture of the dark behind your closed eyes. You're resting in a place that specific, irreplaceable people have kept safe. Not safe in the sense of free from threat. Nothing is free from threat. The whole of Hallownest's history is evidence of that. Safe in the sense of held, attended to, protected by the specific expressions of endurance and commitment and giving and love and warmth that the 5 great knights of Hallownest gave everything to express, and which the ruins of the kingdom preserve in their various forms as evidence that the protection was real, and that the people who provided it were real, and that real things, once they exist, do not simply stop existing when the conditions that produced them change. The impressions are in the stone, the armour is still in the basin, the grove is still warm, the flower is still at the grave, the knight is still at his post. Sleep now. Let the story carry you into the dark the way all good stories carry you, not into nothing, but into the specific quality of restedness that comes from having held something carefully for a while, from having given a narrative the attention it was designed to receive, from having moved through a set of rooms and remembered each one and understood what it was built to hold. The 5 great knights of Hallownest held what they could hold, in their own modes, in their own forms, for as long as what they were holding required holding, and then, each in their own way, they set it down, or transformed into it, or fell in its defence, or carried it down into the dark of dormancy, or became so fully expressed in its service that the distinction between them and it dissolved. They held it, and now you have held it too for a little while. You have carried the story through to its end, which is not an ending in the narrative sense but a resting point, a place where the weight of what has been told can be set down and what was learned from the carrying can be kept. Keep the warmth, keep the endurance, keep the love that will not accept pure silence, keep the commitment that holds what it says it will hold, keep the giving that finds a way. These are not simply the qualities of 5 fictional knights in an underground kingdom. They are the most essential qualities available to any conscious being, creatures shaped by the Pale King's mind gift, or shaped by the ordinary, unlit processes of a world that makes consciousness without knowing why. They are what it looks like when something that is capable of caring decides to care fully, when something capable of loyalty decides to be loyal without reservation. when something capable of love decides that the love is more fundamental than the circumstances that originally made the love possible. The underground is quiet. The 5 great nights are in their places. Whatever comes next for Hallownest, whatever light grows in the deep of the abyss, whatever stirs in the dream realm now that the seal is broken and the radiance has been met with the only force she could not enter and consume, begins from the ground that the 5 great nights prepared by choosing, each in their own mode, not to be nothing when everything around them was becoming something close to nothing. That ground is still here. You are resting on it. Sleep now. The 5 great nights keep their watch. Rest now, completely. The dark is warm. The stone is patient. The love that insisted on finding an expression is still here, in the quiet, in the shape of a story that was worth telling and that you were worth telling it to. Sleep. The 5 great nights of Hallownest hold their places in the deep stone. Hegemol and Dryia and Isma and Zima and Ogrim. 5 names, 5 qualities, 5 shapes of the most essential human things, preserved in the ruins of a kingdom that was built from consciousness and fell to the grief of a forgotten goddess, and was found at the end by something made of the void, who understood that the only ending available was not containment but confrontation. They made that finding possible, each in their own way, each in the specific mode of what they were. The kingdom could not be saved, but the ground was held. The impressions were made. The stories were left in the stone for someone to find. You found them. Now sleep. The underground is very quiet. The dream is already waiting, patient as a great tree whose roots extend further than anyone has thought to measure, warm as a light in the deepest dark, steady as a knight who does not know how to stop waiting for the world to need him again. Fall into it. Rest.